Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Don, for this, for making this event possible, to the provost and the university for making this commitment to free speech. And I just want to start, I'm going to get to my guest in 1 second. Benjamin Franklin said, republics and limited monarchies derive their strength and vigor from a popular examination into the action of the magistrates. Thomas Jefferson said, our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost. For it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government. I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. I think all presidents, by the way, once they become president, rethink that notion. But as I'm sitting next to one of the iconic figures in American journalism, and Marty Baron has been a champion of freedom of the press and the role that it plays in our democracy from the very beginning at the Miami Herald. He was the editor at the Miami Herald after a long and distinguished career at the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, at the Boston Globe, famously encouraged and supported the Spotlight investigation into the Catholic Church that had so much impact on the church and on society. And at the Washington Post, where, among other things, the Post was the newspaper that published the Edward Snowden files about National Security Agency surveillance, and obviously covered the tumultuous events of the last decade. Marty, when I read that Franklin quote, it strikes me that he and you are very much in accord as to why the press is so important to a functioning democracy.
Yeah, I think that's true. He said it better than I could ever say it, of course. But look, I mean, the reality is.
Did you say a penny saved is a penny earned, or was that him?
I said it first. He followed. Yeah, exactly. Retrospectively. In any event, look, I mean, I think the role of the press is to give the public the information that it needs and deserves to know so that people can govern themselves. The reality is that while we in the press, we depend on a democracy to survive, democracy depends on a free press as well to survive. There simply has never been a democracy without a free press. Those who wish to move away from democracy and move toward autocracy, the first step is to try to crush a free press. And in doing so, they're crushing really the institution that most regularly stands up for free expression. And the goal is to extinguish free expression for all people. And so, and our rights, look, they're in the First Amendment. Same with the right for free expression, for free speech for everybody. We don't have any special rights. And so it's what we do is really a manifestation of free speech. And it's essential to the success of any democracy.
But it strikes me as being much harder today than, sorry to say, 50 years ago when you and I began in journalism, for a whole range of reasons. One of them is, we just came from the Cronkite School of Deans, sitting right here, had a wonderful conversation with students there. I think about Walter Cronkite, and I think about the fact that when he went to Vietnam in 1967, he came back and reported on what he saw, and it was a very, very dark account of what was going on in Vietnam. And Lyndon Johnson famously said to one of his aides, when you've lost Cronkite, you've lost America. That is not the case anymore. Journalism is very fractionalized. Talk about that and how much that has complicated the mission of being the purveyor of fact
Right. Well, there's no Cronkite today. No one like Cronkite. No one who is viewed with being imbued with the kind of authority that the American public. That's how they viewed Walter Cronkite. Today, as you said, we live in an incredibly fragmented media market, ever more fragmented. That became clearly evident during this past presidential election, where influencers and people on TikTok and podcasters had, you could arguably far more power than traditional.
We're just talking on the way over here about the podcast that Trump did
with Joe Rogan.
Yes, with Joe Rogan. And 2 days after the podcast, it had 46 million views on YouTube.
Right.
There's no broadcast show or network that can command that kind of.
Nothing like that. I mean, look, when I was growing up, we had 3 major networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC. In my household, we watched the Huntley-Brinkley Report. Yeah. There was only the New York Times was not a national publication. It did not have national distribution. There was no national newspaper at the time. We had in my community. I grew up in Tampa, Florida. We had 2 newspapers there, a morning newspaper and an afternoon newspaper. That's it, really. And there were only really 3 major magazines, primarily Time. Newsweek was sort of a second place, and then there was U.S. News and World Report. That's it. That's essentially and local news station. That's essentially the media environment. Of course, now the barriers to entry to get into this business or into media generally is effectively zero. All you need is a laptop. All you need is a camera
or a smartphone.
Right, a mobile phone or anything, and just turn on the camera on your laptop, and then you're an international television network essentially. And so that's led to all sorts of players in this field of one sort or another. And the result is that there is now, for a variety of reasons, I guess, but that's a major factor, is that there's no commonly shared set of facts. We can't even agree on how to determine what a fact is. All of the elements that we've traditionally used to determine facts are being devalued and denied and denigrated and what have you. And so that's a dangerous place to be, not just for the press, which is one factor, and not just for democracy, but really for human progress. When you look back to the Enlightenment and what was required to actually make human progress, we ultimately said, okay, we're going to focus on what reality is. We're going to set aside, a pre-existing doctrine of whatever sort, whether it's political or religious or whatever it might be, and we're going to dispassionately look at the evidence and do it as scientifically as we possibly can. And that will set the path for human progress. Today, we're losing that.
Well, you wrote, this is your book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. In this book, you describe what I think was a kind of watershed moment in some ways in this whole discussion. It was shortly after the inauguration in 2017, and there was, you'll all remember this kind of quibbling about how large the crowd was, and the insistence of the president's press secretary that this was the largest crowd in the history of inaugurations, which it plainly, demonstrably wasn't. And Kellyanne Conway was on Meet the Press, and Chuck Todd said, the fact is that this is the number of people here. Here are the pictures. And she said, well, the president has alternative facts. And and everybody laughed, as some are laughing here, but that became very much a reality of today's media environment. You can have your own facts, and you can have your own networks and social media platforms that affirm your own facts. They may not be informed facts, they may not be true facts. And that seems very destructive to the project you describe.
It is. There's no question. I mean, I think that look, as you point out, people laughed at that at the time that it was said by Kellyanne Conway, and yet that's become the reality. Is that their alternative facts are everywhere. They're not actually facts; they're just alternative things, and whatever the term is that you can use for that. And the reality is that people have confused their own beliefs with facts. and they're looking for so-called facts that affirm their pre-existing worldview. And all of us have to recognize that we don't know everything, and that sometimes frequently there will be evidence that contradicts what we previously thought was true. And if we're honest with ourselves, we will then look at that evidence and say, well, I was wrong. And I have to accept the evidence that's in front of me because it was objectively obtained. And that doesn't exist right now. People, they're attached to their beliefs, they're sticking to their beliefs, and they have come to view their own beliefs as facts themselves.
I mean, part of this has to do with the profit incentive for social media platforms. I mean, their incentive is to keep people online. It's not really, I mean, I can't speak for X right now, but most of them are not there to promote a political agenda, but they are there to keep people online. And their great inspiration is that the way you keep people online is to appeal to outrage, anger, conspiracy theories, and everybody and they push you into your silo, these algorithms. Everybody within the silo has their views affirmed, if not informed. And everybody outside the silo becomes not just someone with a different point of view, but an enemy. And this has pervaded our politics as well. But it also has contributed to the erosion of trust in news media organizations that present inconvenient truths.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, clearly the algorithms of the major tech platforms have rewarded outrage, they've rewarded anger. People are much more engaged if they are upset, if they're and they've detected that, and they reward that, and they capitalize on that because they want people to stay on their sites as much as possible. And then, of course, they just feed them more of what they would they seem attracted to. And yes, that's created bubbles. It's created bubbles on the left. It's created bubbles on the right. It's created bubbles of all sorts. And I think that's something that the public really needs to be aware of: is how are they being manipulated by tech platforms? And they clearly are being manipulated by tech platforms because that's their commercial model. And that is extended to all sorts of other players as well, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's on TikTok or whether it's on Reddit or wherever it might be.
When we were just speaking with the students, you talked about the Washington Post. The Washington Post had made great progress. I'd say this behind your back when you were there, but it was also during a period of great turbulence when the intensive reporting that you were doing about American politics and President Trump and so on lured readers to you. Many of them went away during the more somnolent or whatever you want to worry of the Biden era, and
Good word.
And now you say they're coming back. Now, so in a sense, the Post profits from some of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a legitimate point to make. I mean, look, at the time, a lot of people were concerned that we didn't have institutions that's in this country that were going to keep a close watch on Donald Trump. They were going to hold him accountable in the way that they felt he should be held accountable. And so they were worried about Congress wasn't going to do its job, probably with good reason. They were worried about the courts, that they weren't going to do their job. And so they were looking at the press for the first time. They were not necessarily taking us for granted. And when they looked at the press, they looked at essentially two organizations. I mean, these are people who obviously were not in favor of Donald Trump, but they looked at two news organizations that they thought were going to be doing the kind of reporting that they felt was necessary. And that was the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so, yes, there's no question that we benefited from it. I mean, it turned out that as much as Donald Trump criticized us, he was absolutely our best salesman.
The point he made often.
He made very often, and he was absolutely right about that. He drove people to us. And so, but we didn't do that. The difference is that was not our model. Our model was, look, he's the president of the United States. The president of the United States is the single most powerful person in the world. There's simply no competition. I don't think there is.
What about Elon Musk?
He's a close competitor right now, but he too depends on the president of the United States. But in any event, So, but that was not our model to say, hey, let's give them these folks more of what they're looking for, because we would publish stories that would contradict what some of these readers would have preferred to read, and they would get very upset with us that we had done that, because among a lot of readers, they say, well, whose side are you on? And are you an ally of them, or are you an ally of us? And my view is, well, we're supposed to be the ally of facts and of truth. And that's who I feel like I'm an ally of, is I want to know what the facts are. And I feel an absolute obligation. I did feel an absolute obligation at the Post to say, look, our primary responsibility as a news organization here at the Washington Post is to find out what our government is doing, to find out what our president is doing. Who is it going to affect? Who's influencing those decisions? Those are the kinds of things that we are absolutely obligated to do. It's absolutely the reason that we have a free and independent press in this country. It's exactly what the founders envisioned when they authored the First Amendment. That's what James Madison, who was the primary author, talked about, is examining, public authorities and measures, and public figures and measures.
He also hated the
well,
press.
Everybody hates the press eventually. Even the press hates the press. So, that's just the nature of things. It's not a popularity. It's not a popularity game. I didn't go into this to be a popular person. So, because you're always going to find somebody who's going to be upset with what you wrote. That's the way it goes. But anyway, that was not our economic model.
Something interesting. You said that there was a constituency for what you were doing, largely among people who didn't support the president, and that speaks to some of the problem. There is no unifying figure. There is no unified conversation, and this has not been uncommon in American history. We had yellow journalism and people selecting very, very partisan publications throughout history. It was kind of the thing that changed it was broadcast media and television more than anything that created this period. But it seems like social media has added a dimension and just the pace of technology that has made it harder.
Yeah, it's changed. I've said frequently that it's as if we're going back to the era of the ideological pamphleteers that we saw at the beginning. That was essentially the origins of American media. It was highly ideological. It was a bunch of pamphleteers. If you read Stacy Schiff's great biography of Samuel Adams,
yes,
he was like a purveyor of fake news.
Absolutely.
He totally made stuff up completely, all with a good cause, of course, which was the idea to separate from the British and to have our independence. Yes. But he made stuff up about it, and the British authorities like, where the hell did this come from?
Right.
This didn't happen.
Right.
But, people believed it, and he did it for ideological reasons.
Yeah. In terms of this issue of trust, you also report on, and I think also another watershed moment, or at least watershed or seminal revelation, was the conversation that Trump had with Leslie Stahl after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated. He was preparing for an interview with 60 Minutes, and they had a little sidebar meeting, and she asked him, why are you always picking on the press? Why are you picking on the news media? And he said, because I don't want people to believe you when you say bad things about me, which is fundamentally honest. But also, it is a principle of autocracy that you destroy sources of accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just the media that he was trying to destroy as a source of independent arbiter of facts and truth and what have you. Truth is a big word, but basic facts. And it was the courts. The same thing with the courts. Same thing with Congress. Any congressional report, anything like that. These days, the independent auditors within each of the inspectors general, they've got to go. Any independent arbiter of fact. And look, the reality is that Trump had a lot of success. In fact, he talked later about one of his greatest successes as president of the United States was to undermine public confidence in the press. He views that as one of his greatest successes. And it's still a goal of his to continue that. There's no question about it. And it's not just the press, as I said, it's any independent arbiter of fact. So he discredits judges who rule in ways that run contrary to his preferences. He doesn't want any independent, really, inspectors general. He doesn't want any independent assessment of him or and not just his policies, but his presentation of the facts. Doesn't want any contradiction whatsoever. And you know, I mean, I think that in any society we should have independent checks, and the press is one of them. It's a very important one. We're not perfect, of course, but because there is no institution that's perfect, and no people who I know who are perfect, because you make mistakes of fact, you make mistakes of judgment, all of that. But altogether, you know, we all have to recognize our own fallibilities, right? And the president of the United States, with the power that he has, should accept that he is subject to scrutiny. That's the nature of a democracy.
And recognize his own fallibility.
And recognize his own fallibility.
He throughout the campaign talked about Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, who is really a strongman at this point. Hungary's it's a democracy in form only, but very much functions like an autocracy. And I mentioned I had dinner recently with the returning ambassador from Hungary, David Pressman. And he told me that the first thing that Orban did was to encourage oligarch friends of his in Hungary to buy the major news media organizations and contribute them to foundations which Orban ran through surrogates. And that's what happened. And that essentially killed an independent media in Hungary. We have a much more robust infrastructure here. We have safeguards that, and you know, and traditions that are in place. But I mentioned Elon Musk earlier, his purchase of X in an era when so many people are now getting their news not from, I mean, the word newspapers is one that only people over a certain age use. It's baffling to people under a certain age. What are those things? Newspapers. But X has a tremendous amount of influence over how people think, and Elon Musk himself has 200 million followers and is a purveyor of a lot of disinformation and conspiracy theories. And he would say that's the exercise of free speech. So I have two questions. One is, what are the ramifications of these kinds of alliances? And obviously Fox News is a different but relevant piece. But also talk to me about that interpretation of free speech.
Yeah, well, you know, Orban is the model for Trump. It's absolutely certain. I'm absolutely certain of that.
Well,
there's still, right, he said so, and there's still some remnants of an independent press in Hungary, but they've been marginalized. They don't have the reach that they had in the past, and you know, and he has had his allies, like a lot of autocrats have done, where media that's in a weakened state that he himself has actually helped weaken, then they use their allies to purchase, business allies to purchase those media organizations and put them essentially in the ideological camp of the autocratic leader. This has happened in other countries too. You look at Venezuela. It's not just on the right; it's on the left too. And Venezuela with Chavez and now Maduro, you know, they weakened the independent media. They had business allies acquire them, and they're basically propaganda arms of the state. That's what exists today. And so, you know, and you have somebody. So then you have somebody like Musk who controls X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and has really abused his power. It's not that he has 200 million followers. Even everybody gets whatever he says. I'm not a follower of his, and yet whenever I go onto Twitter, which is as little as I possibly can, he's immediately at the top. He's at the top of my feed, even though I am not a follower of his. And so, and that's an abuse of power. And now, I mean, so the question is, what's the future of TikTok if it gets banned in the United States? And Trump is talking about creating a sovereign wealth fund that would purchase TikTok. that sovereign wealth fund means it would be controlled by the U.S. government, and that's what people are talking about now, that's concerning. And even if there were no sovereign wealth fund, Trump has encouraged Musk to buy it. He's talked about other people who are associated with him buy it. Steve Mnuchin, who was his Treasury Secretary, has talked about possibly forming a group to buy it. So, I do think we should be concerned about that.
What about the pressures on legacy news organizations like the Washington Post? You wrote in your book, you think I overstated it, but I said glowingly at our last event about Jeff Bezos's willingness to stand up to pressures and economic pressures from the administration under the last Trump presidency, and that in fact the question came up in one of the posts, I guess before the 2020 election. Was it on the endorsement, or was it the 2016 election? Someone, your publisher, I guess, raised the question as to whether the Post should be endorsing candidates, and Bezos said, "Well, why would we not do that? Of course we should do that." And he acknowledged to you that there was some risk to him, material risk that we saw play out for his other businesses. Amazon lost a $10 billion contract with the Pentagon, and so now we see a much different scenario. In fact, Bezos pulled the endorsement 2 weeks before it was supposed to air. I guess 2 weeks before the election.
Yeah, 11 days. Yeah.
11 days before the election, but who's counting?
Right. I was.
Yeah, because having lavish praise on him, you were now very tough on him for doing that. And since then, he and all of the major leaders of the social media platforms, they were sitting in the front, not the front row, but one of the front rows in the St. John's Church before the inauguration, in front of the cabinet. They all donated. Mark Zuckerberg conceded in a suit to Trump and gave $25 million, I guess, to his library fund. And there are all kinds of indications of operations conceding. The ABC settled a suit for $15 million against them that many thought was very contestable in court. Paramount and CBS now in negotiations on a settlement. Trump sued them because he didn't like the way they edited an interview with Kamala Harris on 60 Minutes, the most venerable of news shows. I can go on and on, but there are a lot of indications of the power and leverage that is now held over like legacy news organizations. What does that do to the ability to pursue facts and truth in the manner that you say is the sacred obligation of the news media?
Yeah, well, I am very concerned about that. I mean, as you pointed out, when the decision was made at the Post by Jeff Bezos himself not to run an editorial of a presidential endorsement for the first time in almost 50 years. They'd been doing it almost every year since 1976. And they started doing it in 1976, obviously, as a reaction to Watergate, a president who abused his power as president, who was basically weaponizing the U.S. government against his political enemies. And then here we were in 2024, and the decision was made not to make an endorsement. I called it cowardice and spineless and all of that. And I am super concerned about that. And when somebody like, you cited a bunch of examples, but somebody like Bezos himself is up on the dais during the inauguration. I mean, by the way, I should back up. When they didn't endorse for president, he published a piece in the Washington Post saying that all of us need to work harder to establish our credibility and to establish our independence as a journalistic institution. But then he appeared on the dais in front of cabinet members during the inauguration. And that does not suggest to me working harder to establish your credibility and your independence. It doesn't establish independence. It demonstrates dependence on Trump and on the government generally for other business. And I worry that he's prioritizing his other business interests over the Washington Post at the moment. I'm very concerned about that. That said, at the Washington Post today, I still see just tremendous, vigorous reporting on the Trump administration, the kind of work that I like to see. I believe that over the last couple of weeks, they've done some of the best work out there that I can see. And it's exactly the kind of work that I would want to see from them. They continue to have, despite a tremendous exodus of talent, which I lament, and I don't think it was necessary, that things could have been done to avoid that. They still have a lot of talented journalists there. They seem energized by their mission when you have a new government like this one to tell the American public what's happening behind the scenes. And they've done a tremendous job, particularly with regard to Elon Musk and the pseudo-governmental agency called Department of Governmental Efficiency, where you have a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old who have access now to people's private information because they have access to the entire payment system of the Treasury Department, and they'll get access to Medicaid records and Medicare records and all of these records that you thought before were entirely private, and now will be in the hands of people you don't even know, and that who got security clearances, but it's not at all clear. It seems actually likely that they did not go through the normal security.
Well, the president
process.
signed an executive order on the first day allowing him to give a top secret security clearance to anyone who hasn't yet gone through the process in the interim. So it could be. That comment about 19-year-olds, though, by the way, I just want to say, if there are any in the audience here, that wasn't meant to denigrate
you. Too.
So
you too can run the U.S. government.
You touched on a little bit of that the news media is not infallible. And you wrote in your book, and you've said elsewhere, that the news media was not entirely responsible for its own for the decline in trust. Talk to me a little bit about that and how you feel the news media has hurt its own credibility, and what the news media needs to do to win back trust.
Yeah, I do think we bear a lot of responsibility for our own predicament today. I think first, look, I mean, a lot of the election of Trump in 2016 and again in 2024 was a reaction against the elite, the so-called elites. The media, traditional media, was classified as the elites, even though they're not paid accordingly. But they were classified as the elites. And I think the concern that people had is that they didn't see their lives properly, adequately, fairly reflected in the coverage, that we did not understand the struggles that people were going through, the aspirations that they had for their lives, the expectations they have of government to help them. We did not reflect that adequately. And it's true. I think that we were in our own, I mean, too many of us were in our own bubble, and the coverage, we didn't get out into the country enough to reflect that. And so, or even to our own local communities well enough. That's number one. Number two is, I think a lot of the behavior of journalists has been inappropriate, particularly on social media, where people have decided that, you know, they're behaving more like activists than they are behaving like journalists, independent journalists.
You banned that, right?
I didn't ban it. We had our own standards. They were actually written in 2011 before I ever got there. The guidelines for behavior on social media, which, to summarize it, is basically to exercise care and restraint, not to make yourself the center of the show. You're not the center.
Kind of counter to the whole raison d'etre of social media.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on social media, again, I mean, the more outraged you are, the more you express strong views, the more followers you're going to get. And too many journalists, I think, played to that and fell into that, what I consider to be a terrible trap. And then people look at that and they say, "You're not an independent journalist."
What about in your own copy? How much time and effort did you and your editors spend looking at copy to see that the line between coverage of fact and judgment hadn't been, sort of personal judgment hadn't been crossed in ways that were, because it seems, there are things going on, you pointed them out right now, that are, fundamentally violative of constitutional principles. A constitution is divided into 3 articles, and the first one assigns to Congress certain responsibilities, the second one to the president. Every president tests that, but not to the degree that we see right now. And there are things that are true, but how do you write them in such a way that you don't become a player in the debate?
It's hard. I mean, look, there is always subjective judgment involved in things that we do. On the other hand, I really do believe that we should approach our jobs as objectively as we possibly can, and that means not is basically recognize our own preconceptions. But when we go about our reporting, saying, okay, we're going to look at all of the available evidence. We're going to look at all the documents necessary. We're going to talk to all the individuals who are relevant to speak with, and then we're going to look at what are the facts, what can be verified, what can we actually say without letting our own preconceptions get in the way, or even our own, political leanings, because everybody has an opinion. I mean, you can't be a human being without an opinion. So, but it's important that we, tell people objectively what is actually happening and let people judge for themselves. That's one of the roles of editors, as you were suggesting, is to raise those questions with reporters to say, okay, can we really say this? Are we saying too much?
How much did that come up?
Well, it comes up a lot in newsroom where you have editors. In a lot of these new outlets, there's no editor. There aren't even any reporters.
Right.
There's no reporter who leaves the booth or the house or what have you. I mean, they're not out there. I mean, you have this horrible, tragic crash between an airplane and a helicopter in Washington. It's the traditional media that are out there with reporters. The traditional media are going and looking through the archives of the FAA and the records for Reagan National Airport and all of that. They're the ones who are actually doing the hard work. Same thing with the fires in Los Angeles. I mean, it's the traditional media that are out there looking at what's happening, talking to people who've lost their homes. And interestingly, during times like that, people tend to turn to the traditional media to find out what's going on. They don't say, hey, I'm going to go to my favorite influencer to find out what's happening with the fire here in Los Angeles, or really what happened here with this accident at Reagan Airport. They tend to go to the traditional media, which suggests to me a reserve of confidence in the work that we do that somehow evaporates as time goes on and people decide to make political issues out of these sorts of things. So it is the job of the editors to start asking these questions. Do we ask it often enough and tough enough? I think there's work to be done. I think there's a lot of work there to be done. I think we've gotten to a point where too many editors are kind of afraid of their reporter. It used to be, I'm sure. Look, you grew up in the Chicago newsroom, the Chicago Tribune.
Yeah,
the editors were fearsome.
They were,
right. I mean, that's what I grew up with, and there were no sensitivities about some rough editor saying, what the hell is this? How can you say this? This doesn't make any sense. Why haven't you talked to somebody else here? And they would do it in a very blunt way.
Yes.
And I think that was not that we have to be so blunt these days, but we do have to ask the same questions. And there is less of that, I would say less of that confrontation, necessary confrontation or questioning in newsrooms today than I believe there should be.
You write about the discussion within your own newsroom about when and if to use the word lies versus falsehoods. Talk to me about that. Is there a distinction between the two, or is it just how it sounds to the ear?
Well, there is a distinction. I mean, a lie is something that somebody it's a deliberate falsehood, right? So you know it's true, but you say something false anyway. A falsehood could be you know it's true or you don't know it's true, but it's just false. All right. So there is a distinction. We were slow. I mean, I don't know if we were slow, but we took our time.
Careful.
Careful. There we go. That's a better word.
Yes.
Much more
I'm
careful.
here to help.
Thank you. Thanks for the editing. We were careful. We were careful to not use that word, lie, until we could establish and document that, with regard to Trump, that first of all, once you use the word, you can't take it back. So you need to be careful with the language that you're using. Secondly, we did acknowledge what the definition of lie is, so that we needed to know that Trump knew that what he in fact was saying was not true. We waited until we had that, opportunity, and that's when we first used the word lie, is that when we could actually establish that Trump knew that what he was saying was false.
He, of course, in turn would say what you reported were lies and what he was saying was true, which is the battle. And not just with him, but I mean, I think that's become a common tactic in the public discourse to deal with, inconvenient reporting.
Sure. But look, when did we first use it? It's when it was on the payments that he made to Stormy Daniels to keep that story quiet. And then he himself acknowledged later on that he had made the payments. He was aware of those payments, and his own lawyer at the time acknowledged that as well. And so it's clear that he lied. He said that he didn't know anything about it, and he did. All right. So it's established. Yeah, that's fact.
It fits the dictionary description. You talked earlier about the coverage, for example, of the plane crash or the fires, and how people turn to legacy media organizations to do it. It takes resources to do that kind of reporting. It takes resources to do investigative reporting. Talk about the impact of the internet and of this proliferation of sources of information, or what purports to be information, on the business model of news organizations. Because one of the reasons, I mean, Bezos he plays a heroic role in your book because he came and bought the Post and provided resources for you to do the kind of reporting that you felt the newspapers should do. But the flip side of that is you become reliant on a guy who has other interests, and that can, as we discussed earlier, be turned into leverage. But a lot of news organizations don't have Jeff Bezos behind them. And a lot of newspapers have perished in the last 20 years in this country. And a lot of them have cut back on what they can do. Talk about that, and particularly, not just as it relates to how we cover Washington, but how we cover local community.
Well, look, I mean, the business model for traditional media has been eroding for quite a long time now. I became the editor of the Miami Herald in the year 2000. It was already eroding then. And it accelerated, particularly in the 2007, 2008, because of the penetration of high-speed broadband connections, because of then the development of the iPhone and the smartphone, and then because of social media, which, you had the founding of Twitter, the founding of Facebook, all of that right at that time. That really hit the media hard. Prior to that, you had erosion of going back before 2000, you had the erosion of the classified advertising.
Yes.
Highly profitable because of Craigslist. So that could be done much cheaper, much more effectively online than it was done with printed classified ads, which was a
major source of
revenue for it was hugely profitable. I mean, keep in mind, newspapers back in the old days, first of all, they had 40, 50, 60% profit margins at that time. That's extraordinary. It was a reflection of their monopoly and their oligopolies. We didn't write so much about monopolies and oligopolies then because we were the beneficiaries of it, but we should have. And the reality is that all of that evaporated very, very quickly. And then over time, you had, because of the internet, because of high-speed broadband, because of the availability of now video and audio and all of that online, which didn't used to be the case. I mean, maybe there are people here who remember when you had to download a photo online and you would watch as the photo scrolled, and you would wait to see the entire image. It took forever. And so, but that was no longer the case. And so then new media outlets emerged, right? And the cost of entry into the business was effectively zero, as we were talking about. And so,
as you point out, the things that were lost were editing, time for reflection before you
Yeah,
published.
there's so much that's been lost. I mean, speed is puts enormous pressure. The ability, people expect to get information instantaneously wherever they are at any time of the day. And that's the competitive environment that we're in. When I was at the Post, we had a metric, incredibly punishing metric, which I mentioned in the book, about that we were measured for our alerts to let people know of news by the second against our primary competitors. And the ranking was not that you're 1 second behind or 5 seconds behind. It's either you're 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. That's it. And if we were not 1 or 2 over 2 weeks on average, I heard about it from my publisher at the time that like, why are we not doing better? We have more resources than these guys or those guys or whatever it is. And a tremendous amount of pressure to be first. And look,
what does that do, Marty, to the ability to be comfortable and certain about the things that you're reporting?
It's super difficult. Look, I mean, our philosophy always was to let's make sure we're right. It's better to be late than to be wrong.
I mentioned the old saying in Chicago that this guy A.A. Dornfeld from the Chicago News Bureau had a sign on his door saying, "If your mother says she loves you, check it out."
Yeah, right.
So
right, and then I told you there's a new corollary. Make sure she's your mother too. So, so you got to do a lot of checking. But when you're working in seconds, you don't have a lot of time for that. So, and people do judge you. Are these people on top of things? Are these guys are faster than those guys? You know, these guys were 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes behind somebody else. That it creates enormous pressure. And it's just one of the many pressures on news outlets right now. And look, when the Washington Post makes a mistake, it can become a huge issue, and people will capitalize on that and criticize us. And look, we deserve the criticism. You don't want to get things wrong. On the other hand, when minor outlets like somebody on social media says something that's wrong,
or even not minor outlets, even if it's Elon Musk.
Well, right, he's the biggest. I mean, look, the reality is that he is the single biggest spreader of fake news in the world today. I mean, he has abused his power, as we were talking about before, and he disseminates things that are conspiracy theories that are based on nothing, some tweet that he saw from somebody else, and he then retweets it. He doesn't do any independent verification whatsoever. And meantime, he criticizes the so-called fake news. He doesn't do anything even close to that. Not even an attempt to do anything close to the verification that a Washington Post does, or a New York Times does, or one of the networks does. And so
it gives him an asymmetric advantage, though, doesn't it? In these sort of
he owns one of the primary social media platforms. He's forced his tweets down everybody's throat, whether they follow him or not. So if you're on the platform and you go onto it, you're immediately going to see what he has to say. And he has 200 million followers, but the reality is that hundreds of millions of additional people see what he has to say, even though they're not followers of his. So it has a huge impact.
Yeah. So in the just few minutes we have left, talk about what it feels like we're at a hinge moment in this discussion that we're having. I know we've had periods in our history before where the media has struggled. We've talked about the Alien and Sedition Act of 1787.
Yeah,
1798, yeah.
1798.
Sorry, 1798. And Wilson during the World War I period. But because of the introduction of technology and the ability to manipulate that, this seems like a more pressing moment. Talk about the moment we're in, but also just to finish on a hopeful note, tell me what gives you hope about steering through this period and maintaining freedom of the press as a fundamental tenet of American life.
Sure. So you talked about a hinge moment. I think of it as an unhinged moment, but okay. Look, when we were talking about this earlier, when we can't agree on a common set of facts, we're in really dangerous territory. I mean, how do you make human progress? How do you agree that to value the world, that nobody's perfect, but to value experts, people who have expertise, people who have experience, people who evaluate evidence and to say, no, we're going to throw that all out because I think that this is the way that I think.
How do we hold institutions accountable,
How-
which was the fundamental concern of the founding fathers?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's just really dangerous territory for us. I mean, regardless of what your political views are, and I totally believe in democracy and that we should have vigorous debates about what policy should be. I completely believe in that, but fundamentally, we need to work from a common set of facts. You know, it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said famously, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts." And now we live in a time when people think, "Oh, I am entitled to my own facts. In fact, I can just make them up." So
share them with the world.
Share them with the world, and I will make money doing so. And that's the world that we live in today. So, given all that, you would like to know.
Give me the hopeful
makes me
close here.
optimistic.
Yes, yes.
That's really asking a lot.
That's
I
why I threw it to you.
Yeah, right. So I always try to be optimistic and remain optimistic because I just don't know anybody who succeeds by expecting he or she's going to fail. And I think it's important that we make a better society and that we should all work at it with the hope and expectation that we will succeed. And look, I mean, I see like at this university, there are a lot of new people getting into the field of journalism. They're going to be
met with a room full of very
met with them
inspiring young
right here at ASU, and so they're going to be better at communicating. They will be better. They will learn from, let's say, our competitors, influencers, podcasters, what have you. They will provide good competition, but also be faithful to the core values of the profession of fundamentally verifying facts, gathering those facts, verifying them, putting them in the proper context. That's what we ought to strive for, even if we're not always perfect at doing so. But that's what the ideal. And so I see new people getting into the field, and I also see some new media outlets that I think are doing a really good job and attracting an audience and approaching things.
Many of them not for profit.
Some are not for profit. Some are still profit, and actually, still doing really great work. My former employer, the Boston Globe, they continue to do really great work. They're doing investigative reporting. They're covering the community. They're covering the state of Massachusetts and New England. They seem to be drawing subscribers at a pretty good rate. I don't know that how much money they're making, but they seem to be on a sustainable. They seem to be on a sustainable path. And then we have new models that we're experimenting with new models. I mean, here at ASU just got a nice grant from the Knight Foundation, where I'm on the board. Sorry to mention that again, but from on the board, and
he's actually here on a site visiting. We forgot to.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the whole idea is to experiment with new models, to measure what works, what doesn't work, what can be most effective, and to impart that information to the rest of the media universe. And we need more experimentation. And I hope, and I think we're developing a sort of a new generation of journalists who are more entrepreneurial in nature than you and I were. We worked we were like hired hands at the place, and we felt lucky to get the jobs that we had. And I think a lot of the young journalists today are much more entrepreneurial, and I think that's what we need. We need an entrepreneurial mindset in our business. And the way that we communicate is definitely is changing, and is going to change even more rapidly. And we need people who can embrace that change
and are agile enough and are comfortable enough with the new technologies. Let me say, since this is under the umbrella of Dialogues for Democracy, that democracy was a very speculative venture from the beginning. The founding fathers, the reason they wrote all of these provisions into the Constitution, including freedom of the press and freedom of speech, the separation of powers and so on, was because they understood the fallibility of men and how difficult this idea of self-government is. And the great challenge to democracy is cynicism. So democracy is, from the very beginning, has been a battle between cynicism and hope. So just to pick up on your theme, we have to remain hopeful and vigilant. That's what our obligation is as citizens. And one of the things that I want to hold up as an example is your career, Marty, and the courageous things that you've done to shine a bright light in dark corners. You have fulfilled your obligation as Benjamin Franklin saw it. neither of us were around when he was around. You pointed that out earlier. I want to make that clear. But I thank you so much for that, and I thank you for being here today.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody.